Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Amanda Williams, and joining me, as always, is Jim Zobel. We are both historians here at the MacArthur Memorial. And the MacArthur Memorial is located in Norfolk, Virginia, the hometown of General MacArthur's mother, Mary Hardy. Now, MacArthur himself was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, and as the child of a career Army officer, he spent most of his youth and then his adult life during his own career moving around the world from post to post. So what was the place that was most like a hometown to Douglas MacArthur? Was it Norfolk, as he sometimes later claimed? Was it Little Rock? Was it a military fort out in the American West where the family had good memories? Was it his beloved Manila for a short time? If you're thinking Milwaukee, Wisconsin, you are correct. That is the place in the United States with the longest, most significant multi-generational MacArthur family connection. And so today we're going to be discussing the MacArthurs and Milwaukee. So Jim, Milwaukee's modern history starts kind of closer to the end of the 1700s. And by the 1830s, 1840s, it's a fairly sizable place in terms of population. It's a very established commercial center. And in 1848, the year that Wisconsin becomes a state in the Union, Arthur MacArthur Sr., the grandfather of Douglas MacArthur, he moves to Milwaukee. Why does he go there and what does he do there?
Family, mostly. Arthur MacArthur was a Scottish immigrant, came over with his mom about 1825, and his new father, this guy Alexander Majet. His father, Arthur MacArthur, had died there in Scotland. The mother got remarried, and then they came to the United States. And when they get there, they settle in Uxbridge, Massachusetts. He'll go to school there, Uxbridge, Amherst Academy, not Amherst College. And then he'll finally go to the Wesleyan College in Connecticut. And then he'll go to school in New York to try and get like a law degree there. And when he's at the school in New York, that's when he meets this girl, Aurelia Belcher. Her father is very wealthy Massachusetts man. They have ties going back to colonial governors of Massachusetts, New Hampshire, and whatnot. But Arthur MacArthur is not really liked by the family. He's an immigrant. He's just starting to hang out like a shingle, to be a lawyer. He doesn't have any kind of money or anything. He's not of any prominent family, but they get married and they go to live there in Chicopee, Massachusetts. And Chicopee is also the home of Chicopee Iron Works, which the Belchers own. So these people have a ton of money. Plus, they are of the political stance of the Whig Party. And Arthur MacArthur is very much a Jacksonian Democrat. At this time, you've got the war with Mexico going on, and Polk Democrats, Whigs are very much against him. And so he's pretty much on the outs with the family the whole time. He tries to get Aurelia to move to New York, where he wants to be a lawyer there, but she's very unhappy and wants to be back with that family in Chicopee, but he can't deal with it. And he's got these friends. One guy is named Rufus King. He was like a graduate of West Point from like 1833. He runs the Albany Journal. He was one, editor. But even though he's a Whig, he's a good friend of Arthur MacArthur's. And he tells Arthur MacArthur he's going to go out to Milwaukee and start a new paper out there, which will become the Milwaukee Sentinel. And Milwaukee seems kind of appealing. It's right on the edge of the frontier. It's grown immensely. It's got banks, it's got wharves, docks. It's very much a mercantile center, but it also has cheap land, and it's a place for someone to go make a name for themselves. And Arthur MacArthur likes that idea, and so in 1845 he had one son with Aurelia, and that's Arthur MacArthur Jr. But then he's going to move out there in 1849, I think, which is right after the place became a state. And so that was the draw. was to go out there and make a name. But when he gets there, he finds there's a very big Scottish society out there. A lot of Scotsmen have immigrated there. He becomes very much a part of that social scene, the Robert Burns Society. He starts that, and then as well, he's with all these other Scottish groups that they have out there. He'll become a lawyer as there. He'll become the city attorney in like 1851. In 1855, he'll run for lieutenant governor and win as the Democratic candidate. But the thing was that the man who ran for governor, this guy, William Barstow, he's elected, but then this guy, Charles Bashford, he contested the election, said that there was all this fraud, a lot of fake votes from the northern territories of Wisconsin where nobody really lives. And it turned out that, Barstow had invented a lot of votes. So the thing is both of them get inaugurated on January 7th of 1855, and both of them claim that they are the governor of Wisconsin. All these militias start showing up in Milwaukee because they're going to fight it out, and then finally the courts in Wisconsin come up and say, that you have no case, Barstow, you got to leave. And Barstow does. He gets out of there. Later on, Bashford will be accused of bribery himself. Prior to that, and he'll be run out of town on a rail himself. But Arthur MacArthur, when they got rid of Barstow as the governor, was governor for like 4 days. But there was no contest of his election as lieutenant governor. So he'll stay the lieutenant governor of Wisconsin, and he'll be I think the third lieutenant governor of Wisconsin. About 1858, he takes up as a judge on the Wisconsin Circuit Court in the 2nd District. And that's where he'll be, get reelected in 63. And that's where he'll be till 1870, when finally he leaves the city of Milwaukee because he gets brought down to Washington to be a judge on the DC Supreme Court down there. Not the Supreme Court of the United States, but, of Washington, DC.
So you mentioned,
and so that's pretty much his connection.
So you mentioned the number of Scottish families that were in Milwaukee. There is another family very connected to MacArthur's. It's the Mitchell family. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Well, Alexander Mitchell in the late 19th century was the richest man in Wisconsin. He is born the same year as Arthur MacArthur. He immigrated as well about 14 years after Arthur MacArthur, but they're both the same age. And when Arthur MacArthur gets to Milwaukee, Mitchell is very prominent. He's pretty much started insurance banking within there, the Wisconsin Marine Bank, and he's gonna amass a pretty giant fortune. The thing is, he's Arthur MacArthur's sponsor when he gets there, and so he'll bring him into the Royal Society. He'll bring him into they'll both start the Robert Burns Society together, and they are very much compatriots, as their families will be throughout the next age. He has the thing is, he has a son named John Mitchell, and Alexander Mitchell will go on to be like the congressman for the Milwaukee district, the 4th district, like 1871, 1873. And his son will be as well. And this is after his dad has been the president of the St. Paul Milwaukee Railroad, like one of the biggest railroads in the country. And people will call him a robber baron, but he's just a man with a ton of money. His son John is good friends with Arthur MacArthur. They're about the same age. They grow up at the same time. But Mitchell is somebody, John Mitchell is somebody who's traveled all over the world. He speaks like 5 languages. He's educated in Dresden. And that's before he comes back to Wisconsin for the Civil War, where he enlists, and he serves in the same regiment as the son does, Arthur MacArthur. And then he'll also be that representative in Congress, but he's a lot, I don't know if he's trying to rectify for his father, because he's the guy who really pushes for the 8-hour workday for the common man. He's the guy who pushes for all these reforms for workers in the United States, very instrumental in that, very liberal minded, so to speak. But he'll also be, when Douglas MacArthur wants to go to West Point, he'll be the one that signs that writes the letter to congressman, to approve him to go there. So they are very much instrumental in their lives. John Mitchell is the father, of course, of Billy Mitchell, the great air chief, and MacArthur will know him throughout his life. I thought this was really interesting to research because I didn't know that Billy Mitchell had a brother, John, that was also an airman that crashed over France in 1917. He's got a sister, Ruth, who's very much different than most women of the time. She's a journalist, goes all through Europe, and Ruth will be with the Chetniks in Yugoslavia during World War II. And as well, Douglas MacArthur knows them very well because he dated both of those Mitchell sisters, Ruth as well as Janet. And so it's like you said, they're tied up with each other pretty much their whole lives. Maybe not so much intimate as Arthur MacArthur Jr. is with John Mitchell and Alexander is with Sr. But yeah, those two families are very much instrumental in each other's lives.
Two very important American families for sure.
Yeah, most definitely. And just weird how they both mix together, out of everything.
All right, you've touched on this a little bit, but let's move from the Arthur MacArthur Sr. generation to the Arthur MacArthur Jr. generation. And like his father, Arthur's life will be a life of service, just not civil or cultural service. He's going to opt for military service. So tell us about his life in Milwaukee.
It's a tough town to grow up in. Before Milwaukee was created, it was almost like two towns, and neither town wanted the other one to exist. And there's two rivers that slice through Milwaukee, the Menominee, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, and the Milwaukee River. So there's bridges everywhere. And when they built the bridges, one town didn't want any road to line up with any road in the other. So none of the bridges ever came together. It was always kind of, so there are divisions throughout the town. And there's, Catholics against Protestants. There's all these Germans, Polish, Irish, they're all against each other. Then you live on that side of the bridge, I live on this side of the bridge. So you pretty much have to be a part of, Arthur MacArthur grows up as part of kind of a gang, these Van Buren boys is what they call them, because that's where they live, is on this Van Buren street. They'll live right next to that King family. He's good friends with Charles King, who will be a West Point graduate, fight in the Civil War, Spanish-American War with him. They'll grow up together the whole time. He's good friends with this kid named James Cogwell. He'll go on to be a rear admiral in the United States Navy. He'll grow up and have all these relationships. All these guys will serve. When the Civil War comes along, they'll all go into the service. Arthur MacArthur will graduate from the Milwaukee High School there, and then go to military school. He'll be always wanting to go off to fight in the Civil War. His dad will actually get him an appointment to see Lincoln. And Lincoln says, I'll get you in 1862, but he wasn't going to wait. So his dad got him into the 24th Wisconsin Regiment there. All of them, really served. That Rufus King, that was the editor of those papers, he goes back into the service. He'll raise the Iron Brigade, which is so famous during the Civil War. And the son of Charles King, he'll serve in that one of those regiments, the 6th Wisconsin. He has another brother, Rufus King, who gets the Medal of Honor like Arthur MacArthur does for service there in White Oak Swamp. So he's growing up with all these kids who see no problem with going into the service as things come along. And that's what really gets his dad to put him into the 24th Wisconsin, because all those other kids were already joining, were already serving. During the war, Arthur MacArthur will come back in 1863 because of he had typhus really bad. He got typhoid fever, and his dad went on like this 300-mile journey and found him in this hospital down south, brought him back to Milwaukee, nursed him back to the health. But it's really weird because Kenneth Ray Young, who wrote that book on Arthur MacArthur, says that it's very frosty relationship between the father and the son. It's almost very formal and very strained. And he talks about Arthur MacArthur coming back to Milwaukee, and he's a frontline soldier, and he sees all these grown men in parlors with cigars fighting the war, not knowing anything about the front, kind of gets disgusted with that. As well, his mom, Arthur MacArthur's mom, kind of lost it in Milwaukee. Nobody knows really what happened. She had another son, Frank, who's Arthur MacArthur's younger brother, in 1853. But in 1857, she goes back to Chicopee, and leaves Arthur MacArthur Sr. with the two boys. Does that create some kind of friction with the father? We really don't know. I mean, and that's the problem with these MacArthur relationships. We don't know a lot about them. But that was always pointed out, that maybe there was some kind of frosty relationship because of those visits. So we know Arthur MacArthur will come back after the war in 65 and try and study for the bar, but then he'll immediately go back in the service. So during that time as a young boy, and then going into the Civil War, it's just that's his whole boyhood, that's his home, and that's the way he's going to look at it throughout his life, Arthur MacArthur Jr. And later on in life, when he comes back, all those people will be there to welcome him, and ready to have him back there, and he'll say that's the happiest times of his life, is back there in Milwaukee with all of his buddies that he grew up with.
So after the Civil War, and after Arthur decides to continue his army career, it's kind of a long kind of path for him to becoming kind of a general. Very disappointing kind of career path for a while. In 1897, though, he's assigned as the adjutant general to the Department of the Dakotas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And the family decides to live in Milwaukee, and he commutes every weekend kind of between the two places. Clearly, he wanted to be in Milwaukee, and that is also going to make the city an important place for his son, Douglas MacArthur, and his older brother, Arthur MacArthur. This is during Douglas MacArthur's formative years. So what is life like for the family in Milwaukee during this period?
Yeah, they'd been down there in Texas, and Douglas MacArthur graduated from that West Texas Military Academy in about 97. And he tried to get that presidential appointment to go to West Point, but he didn't get it. And so they knew they were going to have to apply for a congressional appointment. Arthur MacArthur knows that congressman for that Milwaukee area, that 4th district. And this guy had taken over after John Mitchell, had been the congressman there. And so Arthur MacArthur knows him. They're about the same age. Did they know each other growing up? I'm not sure, but we just know that he knows him very well. And Achin said that Douglas MacArthur would have to take the competitive exam, but he'd give him a shot at getting the appointment. So he and his mom moved to Milwaukee. They lived in the Plankinton Hotel, which was right downtown. They know all those people because of the father's connections as well as the dad's connections. And Douglas MacArthur will get a year of tutoring. He'll go to that West Side High School in Milwaukee, and Gertrude Hall is this very young teacher who takes him on and gets him all up to speed. I mean, he had graduated as valedictorian down in Texas, so it wasn't like she was working with a moron, but she just got his abilities up to where he could take this exam and be able to crush everyone, which he does. When he takes that exam, he beats everybody by unbelievable amount of percentage points. This kind of made everybody in Milwaukee mad, because they're like, why is this kid who didn't grow up here coming back and getting this application and taking it away from these Wisconsin boys? But the Milwaukee Journal and the Sentinel both came out and said, look, this guy's dad is from Milwaukee. His grandfather was. He's had a career in the army that he wanted to be here, but he couldn't be here. Why should we not let Douglas MacArthur come and take this? I mean, he's one of our most famous sons, this Arthur MacArthur connection. And so that kind of smoothed everybody over. And John Mitchell writes the letter for Douglas MacArthur to get entered into West Point. And so that's where the family is in that Plankinton Hotel. In the 1950s, this guy writes MacArthur, and he was the bellboy at that hotel, at the Plankinton Hotel, and talked about how they would always sit there and shoot the bull, when they were talking. And Douglas MacArthur always, I want to go to West Point. Apparently they had some kind of fire there at the Plankinton Hotel while they lived there, and and the guy remarked that Douglas MacArthur was, this ball of activity, helping put out the fire with the firemen that all got there. So, I mean, all these people had these memories later on, and Douglas MacArthur, like I said, would want to date the Mitchell sisters and wrote all these poems to them. We have these original poems that we didn't really know who he wrote them to. And one of them was this far Western girl, and it was written to Janet. But both of the Mitchell sisters say that the poem was written to them, not to one specifically.
Of course.
It was written to both of them,
Of course.
And so that's where that connection is. And Douglas MacArthur will come back there in 1908 when he's serving in that engineer post there. And then 1912, he comes back for the funeral, for his dad. Mm-hmm. So it's a small connection, but he always said, this is the city that launched my military career. And, that he'll always say it's home, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Now, Milwaukee seems to have a lot of respect for the MacArthur family, particularly, after the Spanish-American War, after the start of the Philippine-American War, in terms of Arthur MacArthur Jr. So tell us about the parade that the city throws for Arthur MacArthur Jr. when he kind of returns after these conflicts, and then tell us about his final years in the city.
Well, that's my favorite part about this story of Arthur MacArthur, really. He comes back from the Philippines in 1901. Had a very contentious time there with the civil governor, William Howard Taft, and he was the military governor. They believed very different things about the way the Philippines was going at that time. And he gets removed by William Howard Taft and sent back. And the McKinley administration is being told by Taft not to deal with him, not to give him any kind of respect. Don't let him talk to the papers or anything. Just pretty much abandon him. So when Arthur MacArthur lands in San Francisco in 1901, there's no one to meet him. There's no army representation. There's no nothing. There's no reporters or anything. And he stays at the St. Francis Hotel, same place that Douglas MacArthur will stay when he flies in 50 years later. And he's there at the hotel that night feeling pretty forgotten. And all of a sudden there's a knock on the door, and there's this 3-man delegation from Milwaukee. And they're there to say, come home. All your friends are waiting for you. Everybody wants you to come home and stay with them. And this gets Arthur MacArthur, and that's where he wants to go. And, to have this delegation come there and offer him this, he'll take the train back, and he'll have to go to Chicago first. Douglas MacArthur and his mom are waiting there. Douglas MacArthur is still in West Point. She had been living there at West Point with him, but they come to Chicago to meet him. He has to go see McKinley real quick before he can go back to Milwaukee. And when he does, McKinley realizes that Arthur MacArthur is his kind of guy. They're both Civil War veterans. They were both part of the Grand Army of the Republic, the Military Order of the Loyal Legion. They both think pretty much the same. And McKinley's like, what was the problem? And then right after that, McKinley, of course, gets gunned down. And then when they have the funeral, Arthur MacArthur's there with the Guard of Honor with L. Otis, as well as Admiral Dewey. And so he's, very much prominent at that. But then he'll go to Milwaukee, and he'll show up that morning when he gets there in, I think it's like early September. And when he gets off the train, everybody's there. All of his old friends, Douglas, his mom, and they have this big parade that goes through the city. Everybody turns out for it. And like the last mile, the cars or the processional carriages stopped, and everybody got out and walked the last mile or so, all together, welcome home. And they said that was the biggest thing that he had. He won't be able to stay because he'll go on to run the Department of the Pacific. He'll have that military tour as the observer in the Russo-Japanese War, that tour of agent 0506. But when he comes back, he's made the highest general in America, the lieutenant general. But he doesn't get chief of staff. There's no way that the administration is going to give him that. He had made a lot of statements on the way back in Hawaii that got picked up by the press, where he said, we got to watch out for the Germans. The Roosevelt didn't like that so much. And so he's kind of on the outs. And he's like, well, if I'm not going to get a command, I'm just going to go into Milwaukee. And, as the senior general, I'm sure you'll be calling on me, wanting me to do certain things. And they don't call on him at all. And so he just sits in Milwaukee for 2 years. They get that house on Marshall Street. He'll reignite all those friendships with the Mitchells and with everyone else. And that's where he'll stay until he'll retire in 1909. And then in 1912, he's addressing his old unit, the 24th Wisconsin. There, I think they had 1,700 members originally. And at the end of the war, there was only 400 left. They'd been wiped out. By 1912, there's only about 64 left. You have to remember that Arthur MacArthur was only 17 at that time. And he does this speech at the old Walcott Grand Army of the Republic Hall, and he collapses right in the middle of it and has an aneurysm and dies right there. He gets buried up there in Milwaukee at Forest Home Cemetery, same place the Mitchells are, same place all those buddies of his are. And the wild thing was that after he died, the government wouldn't give Mary Pinckney the full salary. They'll give four other lieutenant generals got a stipend of like $2,500 a month, but they only want to give her half, which is just unreasonable. But then one of Arthur MacArthur's friends, who was there, when he died, was there at the funeral. This guy, James Flanders, was a big lawyer. He sued the government and got the full entitlement that goes to Mary Pinckney Hardy. So you can see how those people looked out after the family, even after that. So that pretty much ended the career and the life of Arthur MacArthur as being connected to Milwaukee. And, that's where the connection was really the strongest, was with that son of Arthur MacArthur.
After Arthur MacArthur Jr.'s death, Douglas MacArthur's career really pulls him away from Milwaukee, but Milwaukee doesn't forget him, and he doesn't forget Milwaukee. When he's U.S. Army Chief of Staff in the early 1930s, the Milwaukee Sentinel celebrates him as, and I quote, a meteor in the military heaven. And they claim that not since Winfield Scott has the American Army possessed such a darling of the gods for Chief of Staff as Milwaukee's MacArthur.
Wow.
So, I mean, that's pretty high, very effusive praise. I'm sure MacArthur liked that. What kind of connection does MacArthur maintain with Milwaukee from this time on?
Does he even, between the death of his father in 1951, does he even have the chance to go there?
I haven't seen anything.
Yeah, I mean, because he goes to Washington right after the death because Leonard Wood brings him there, and then it's World War I. And then he's at West Point, then he's in the Philippines, then he's in Baltimore, then he's in the Philippines, then he's in Washington, so he's at the beck and call of the government, in the U.S. Army, and he doesn't really have this, ability to go to the places that he wants. He always maintains his residency as Milwaukee.
Right.
He because he's moving around every 2 years. He never has a home at all. He'll always say that's his hometown. He's a member of the American Legion as the Alonzo Cudworth Post in Milwaukee. He's signed up with the draft board of Milwaukee. So it's basically, that's what he says is home. And he'll always say that's where he plans on going back to. In 1945, the Milwaukee Journal correspondent, this guy Doyle, got to Tokyo and met with MacArthur and says, come home. And he's like, that's the first place I plan on going is Milwaukee. I've got, business here in Japan, but and Milwaukee was planning on having big parades and everything. They had named Downtown Square after MacArthur, and they were going to wait till he got there to dedicate it. So everyone believed he was going back there. But then when the he does get removed in April. It was funny because Marquette University, which is in Milwaukee, had offered him a Doctor of Laws and said, will you come here and accept it? And this was like March of 1951, a month before he gets fired. And he wrote a letter back to this guy O'Donnell, the Reverend O'Donnell, who was the guy who offered it to him, and said, I have no plans coming back home. I don't think I'll ever be in Milwaukee for quite a while. And then the next month he gets canned by Truman. And so when he comes back to San Francisco and he's at that St. Francis Hotel, like his dad was 50 years earlier, there comes a phone call, and it's Mayor Zeidler of Milwaukee. And he's like, come home. And MacArthur's like, yeah, I'll come there. And so within the first week of being back in the States, he goes to Milwaukee. Thing is he had flown from Tokyo to Pearl Harbor, big parade, big ceremonies. The next morning on a plane to San Francisco, big parade, big ceremonies. Next morning on a plane to Washington, duty honor country speech, everything in Washington. Next morning on a plane to New York parade. MacArthur's 71 years old. A couple of days after that, he's in Chicago. And then they have a drive that drives from Chicago to Milwaukee in this open car in April 25th. And, here's MacArthur 7 days into it. He's got to be completely and totally exhausted. He goes to the dedication, goes to the MacArthur Square, goes to get the Doctor of Laws. But then during the tour, that American Legion post, the Alonzo Cudworth post, had set up a reception at the old house on Marshall Street that was still there at the time. They had set up a reception at the Alonzo Cudworth post. But the thing is, they're all standing out there waiting for MacArthur to stop, have this big gala. And it's almost like that MASH episode where he drives by and salutes and doesn't stop. And they were ticked off that, he doesn't stop. And it's all through the papers. They write him letters. And MacArthur, and says, I had no control over the motorcade, of where it stopped. This was all delineated by the city leaders. But I think it was more in the sense that MacArthur was just done. He couldn't do anymore. I mean, it had been a week of just nonstop flying, driving, speaking, and I think he was just completely exhausted by that point. That night at the hotel, who shows up? Janet Mitchell. She still lives there and comes in and is like, oh, General. And he was like, you call me General again, and I'm going to throw you right out of here. But it just shows that, there were people that still there that remembered him and revered him. He would always say he's coming back, to stay there. But when he gets to New York, they offer him that place at the Waldorf Astoria, right in the middle of Manhattan, right in the middle of all the action. And it's too good to turn down. And so that really ended it, as far as that connection. That's the last time that he goes there is in 1951.
Now, obviously, there is that kind of long-term MacArthur multi-generational connection to the city. But do you think, given how important Wisconsin is in terms of politics and in terms of primaries, in the 40s, 1950s, do you think that MacArthur also tries to maintain something of a relationship with the city, with the state, as part of his political ambitions?
Perhaps, I don't know. He never says that. He has two big power bases, though, in Milwaukee, and that's the LaFollette brothers. They had been governor and congressman of Wisconsin, and that's Philip and Robert. And Philip had been on MacArthur's staff in World War II, as part of the public relations team. And so Milwaukee is that, when they have that 48 primary, MacArthur's name is put into Wisconsin, and Milwaukee is a central power base because of those LaFollette brothers. So yeah, you could probably make that case, that he's looking to have a home base as far as a political career. But the thing I wonder about is, when he comes back in 51, even though he's got all that family, his time in Milwaukee is is not really, doesn't have really glamorous memories. When he's there in '08, we talked about it in that Loves of MacArthur. He goes insane for a girl there, and she doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And I mean, it made him lose his mind. He had the worst efficiency reports of his career during that time. Does that stick with him? I mean, it's 50 years or 40 years later, but also the last time he had been there, he buried his father, there, and you got to have all those memories as well of just that, the guy, his dad being dead upstairs in the house and then having to go through this. And then in 26, he dug him up and brought him to Washington, to Arlington Cemetery. So once the dad's dug up, does he have any reason to go back there? So you just, you wonder about, how those feelings maybe play on that decision not to go back there,
Yeah, interesting. But clearly a lot of connections to the city. Any final thoughts, Jim?
Yeah, all the houses are gone. That house on Van Buren Street that Arthur the Sr had, the house on Marshall Street that Arthur Jr had is gone. The Plankinton Hotel is gone. Pretty much all those sites are. The only place that's left is Alexander Mitchell's mansion, which is now the Wisconsin Club. I mean, it's pretty crazy. But there's still a hardcore group of people that still celebrate that connection with MacArthur. In 1979, Mrs. MacArthur was living in New York, and a delegation from Milwaukee got a hold of her, said, we want to dedicate a statue there. It's one of many that are in the United States, and they contracted a sculptor. They had it created, and they had a big celebration there in '79. Mrs. MacArthur went. A young lieutenant colonel squired her around the city, and that was Lieutenant Colonel John Otgen, who was the grandson of Theobald Otgen, who put him into West Point. And that core remained. The thing is that MacArthur Square was kind of a neglected part of the city. Nobody went there. So in 2014, that same hardcore group moved it down right on the water, right next to the Milwaukee War Memorial there. And they're coming up now on the 70th anniversary of MacArthur's visit there in '51 and accepting the Doctor of Laws. So there is still a contingent there that is very much espouses those ideals of MacArthur and that connection that's there with Milwaukee. And so it's something that still lives on today.
Well, thank you very much for sharing all this information, Jim.
Well, thank you, Amanda. We'll see you sometime soon.